Hey, I've got an urgent assignment for you.
Oh,
If you could get it done by the end of this video, that'd be phenomenal.
yeah, sure. I can. Wait, what do you mean by the end of this? Never mind. Yeah, sure, it'll be done soon.
Thanks a lot, jackass.
Charlie Kirk. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Isaac Newton. This quote is a reminder that everything we build is built on the foundations laid by those who walked before us. And while most of us stand on the shoulders of these mental giants, others prefer to dangle from deep pockets. One of these social media charlatans is Charlie Kirk. Now, I could take the easy route and hinge on Kirk's greatest hits.
Do you truly, in your heart of hearts, truly believe that this is a human being? This,
Without a doubt.
without a doubt,
Yes.
this is a dolphin fetus.
But instead, I've decided to spend a little time analyzing three things: his so-called beliefs, the tactics he uses to sell them, and what some might call rhetorical flair, though others would more accurately label a total lack of nuance. And while I don't even think I've cracked the surface of videos across all Turning Point affiliated channels and social media accounts, I have seen enough of his interviews, debates, speeches, and public appearances to see the cycle of rotating talking points he can't seem to escape. And yet, he speaks with the moral certainty of a prophet. I guess that's what makes Kirk particularly frustrating. It isn't that he gets stuff wrong, being wrong is human. It's the fact that he's so confidently wrong, so insulated from doubt, that his presence alone becomes a kind of epistemological virus. He doesn't just misrepresent information, he teaches people how to avoid counterclaims rather than contest them, turning ideology into instinct and nuance into a pointless endeavor. And this is why he thrives. Not because of the strength of his arguments, but because of the performance of them.
I live like a capitalist every single day, Chank. I live as a
Hey,
capitalist,
hey,
okay?
hey.
I live what I believe.
No.
What do? I get charity every single year.
Hold on.
What's my salary?
Charlie.
Less than his.
Charlie, take
Come on,
a seat.
Chank, let's go.
It's not what he says, it's how loud, how fast, and how smugly he can say it before anyone has time to ask, wait, did that make any sense? And I should make it clear here that the goal isn't to own Charlie Kirk. That's already his brand. My goal is to dissect him, to treat Kirk not as an opponent or a villain, but as a cultural symptom. A mirror cracked and grinning, reflecting the America that fears more than it thinks. Because to understand Kirk is to understand the mechanisms that create figures like him, and the voids they are meant to fill. Charlie Kirk likes to present himself as a grassroots prodigy, a kid with a calling who looked around his high school, saw the creeping shadow of Marxism in the lunchroom, and decided to act. That's the myth. Here's the origin story they don't put on the merch. Kirk was born in 1993 in the suburb of Arlington Heights, Illinois. A comfortable life in a conservative white-collar community. His father was the project architect for Trump Tower, so right out of the gate, we're not talking about a childhood akin to Oliver Twist. He attended Wheeling High School, where he claims to have become more politically active due to noticing liberal bias in his textbooks. At 18, Kirk wrote an essay warning about liberal indoctrination in schools, which landed him a spot on Fox Business. And that appearance led to more speaking events that just so happened to catch the attention of Bill Montgomery, a Tea Party activist in his 70s who essentially adopted Kirk as his ideological apprentice. This was not some organic rise through government or campus protests. This was a targeted recruitment, a political mentorship forged not on the battlefield of ideas, but in a donor-funded incubator. Kirk deferred his admission to Baylor University in 2012. This is the reason he often says he never went to college. Technically true, but like most things with Charlie, it's a partial truth dressed up like a full one. What he doesn't bring up is that he was previously rejected from West Point, a rejection he blamed not on his resume, but on diversity quotas. He also briefly attended Harper College, a community college in Illinois that he quickly dropped out of to focus full-time on launching Turning Point USA. I know this might seem like a minor omission, but I think it speaks volumes. Kirk doesn't like to present the whole truth. He prefers the version that serves whatever narrative he's selling at the moment. So, let's be clear. No bachelor's degree, no formal training in political science, economics, or philosophy, just a high school diploma, a well-timed essay, a couple of speeches, and a wealthy retiree named Bill Montgomery who helped him co-found Turning Point USA at just 18 years old, while Bill Montgomery was a young 72. And if these humble beginnings are starting to seem less humble, here's where the machine really kicks in. By 2015, Turning Point was flush with money from donors like Foster Friess, a multimillionaire evangelical who also bankrolled Rick Santorum's presidential campaign. The DeVos family also reportedly chipped in. His sudden rise to popularity, even eventually getting him a spot on Forbes' 30 Under 30 list in 2018 in Law and Policy, even though he hadn't studied law or created any policy. Kirk isn't some rogue intellectual who clawed his way to relevance. This is a textbook case of venture-funded ideology. A young man molded not by rigorous thought, but by market demand. Charlie might believe in the things that he preaches, but that doesn't mean the people that discovered him didn't think that he was more useful than bright. Charlie Kirk isn't self-made, he's product-made. A line item in someone else's budget. Built from the ground up to sound authoritative without ever earning authority. The only thing grassroots is the outreach he does on campuses in an attempt to hone in on those who were just like him. And in those moments, you see that he speaks with the conviction of a scholar, the certainty of a saint, and the credentials of a motivational speaker at their 30th seminar this week. It's not leadership, it's branding. And how well does it all hold up? From formal debates to prove me wrong tables on college campuses, his shtick is consistent. Paint every issue as a black and white showdown between his personal definition of American values and the indoctrinated dogmatic left. Across topics like abortion, gender, race, and economics, Kirk's toolbox is moral absolutism, patriotic chest thumping, and a suspicious distrust of experts. But in debates with the layman, he's quick to claim victory, treating opponents as naive or hostile. He interacts with questions like a game show host who just realized there's no prize in it for them. When asked about the professor's watch list and the frequent misrepresentation of professors' quotes, Kirk offered this gem.
And I don't understand, these professors, we're not misquoting them.
Yeah. No, I understand
all this
that.
stuff is, we're just making them
But
more
would you agree
famous.
that it's taken out of context, though?
But that's not my fault if someone takes something out of context.
But
so if
you're
I says your
providing
sweatshirt
the
is red,
database.
it's not anyone's fault except the interpreters.
Now, let's pause and admire the logical pretzeling here. Because in this scenario, Charlie is the interpreter. He's the one describing the yellow sweatshirt as red and then blaming everyone else for not understanding his interpretation. This isn't just a rhetorical dodge, it's an invitation to misrepresent, misframe, and then play journalist when called out. I didn't lie, you just didn't understand my point. And that's the real damage. Not just that misinformation spreads, but that accountability is dissolved in the process. It conditions people to polarize first, reflect never, and then blame the chaos on those who point out the flaws in the argument.
You don't think it's a platform where people can spread misinformation?
You can say the same thing about the internet or Twitter or Facebook. It's not incumbent on the person who creates the platform to be responsible for how people interpret it.
Of course.
And it's not just intellectually lazy, it's morally evasive. The professor's watch list isn't just designed to showcase the craziest of professors, of which there are many. It is designed to lump them together with those who are also viewed as ideological opposition, to paint every yellow hoodie red and say it's our fault for pointing out the difference.
Not necessarily.
I don't want to get too deeply into systemic racism just yet. That's a minefield we'll wander into shortly. But when the topic surfaces in relation to incarceration rates, Charlie takes the scenic route.
You mentioned that you don't think there's any institutional racism left in this country. And I think that's a pretty strong statement that I don't necessarily agree with, especially in our justice system, where the United States Sentencing Commission actually contends that black men are 19% more likely to be sentenced, have longer sentences for similar crimes. And that's when every other demographic factor is accounted for, like age, income, I guess, area within society. So I was wondering what you think about that.
He claims that the data on black incarceration rates don't sufficiently account for the quality of their representation, as if the entire system's racial disparities can be chalked up to bad Yelp reviews for public defenders. And then, in classic form, he pivots to the family unit argument.
Quality of their legal representation factored into the study?
I can't speak to that because I don't know.
It's not.
Yeah. All right.
So, for example, if LeBron James committed a crime, he'd have pretty good lawyers, right?
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it's an income and or legal quality point, not a race point. It's not about skin color as much as it is income, which is not about race. It's about other choices, such as, is there a father in the home? For example, if a black has a mom and a dad present, that family and that child has a higher chance of all objective facts of success, college attendance, low likelihood of committing crimes, than a white child that has just a single mother. You see, fatherhood transcends color lines. And what we have learned through massive macroeconomic studies is that when blacks have fathers around, not only do they succeed as much, they succeed even more sometimes than white families.
It sounds noble to want to bring families together until you realize he's not dismantling racism. He's using family structure as a moral crowbar to pry race out of the conversation entirely. And just when you think we've hit peak clumsy framing, Charlie refers to the child from the black household as
a black,
while the other is
a white child.
Subtle? No. Telling? Absolutely. It's the kind of linguistic slip that reveals more than any data point ever could, because you don't accidentally dehumanize someone in the middle of a sentence about their future unless that's already how you categorize them internally. But there's also a smoking gun. It's called data. A 2013 study reported on by NPR in 2017 showed that black and Hispanic two-parent households earned about half as much as white single-parent households. So the solution to this issue isn't as simple as bringing fathers back to the family unit, as if that was ever the easy route. But Charlie isn't a bigot, no, because his bigoted views on the liberties of others are for the betterment of humanity. When asked,
my question for you is, do you have any hate, and is Turning Point USA against the LGBT community?
He replies very reasonably.
How could I hate that which I have a heart for?
Thank you.
Which seems like something that we could ask more of. Compassion. But that compassion will never reach the level of progressive policies.
And I might not agree at that for some of the lifestyle choices that some people make, but of course not. And if someone said, Charlie, what's your view on marriage? I say, I believe marriage is between one man and one woman.
And he's made it very clear he thinks the law should reflect that. Saying that a couple shouldn't be afforded the same economic benefits as another strictly because of their sexual orientation is a bigoted belief. If he thinks that the classification of marriage should be changed to retain sanctity or something, then the onus is on him to try and create that clarification between holy and legal matrimony. It's easy to see that on college campuses, His performances are more theater than dialogue. He claims victory before the debates even start, rallies his supporters with Trump hats flying, and interrupts or dismisses tough questions with smirks and sarcasm. The goal isn't to persuade, but to reinforce tribal unity. But one example of Kirk facing college students without that pretext is from Jubilee in 25 liberal college students outsmart one conservative. Charlie decides to start with the topic of abortion and its legality. He loves definitions and wants to agree that.
Hey, hello, what's your
Hi,
name?
Juliana.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Can
you.
we get our terms right first?
Yeah.
Okay, abortion is the forcible ending of the viability of a being in utero, otherwise known as a fetus. Do we agree that's what abortion is?
Now, that's probably the least hostile abortion statement I've ever heard from Kirk, like he's trying not to scare the freshmen.
His smile is very creepy.
But here's the subtle part. He uses viability as if it applies to the whole pregnancy, when in reality, viability kicks in around the third trimester. Before that, it's just a cluster of cells that eventually gain the ability to reflex, and then so on. This matters because Kirk's argument hinges on equating abortion to murder. Murder is ending a life that has already started, but the real philosophical showdown is about when life starts. His arguments on this topic are mostly recycled from his debates with Ben Glebe, which we'll circle back to later, so we'll move on for now.
This is a dolphin fetus.
Next up, Kirk claims traditional four-year colleges are a scam.
My next claim is that college is a scam.
So, college is a scam.
Well, let's define our terms. College being traditional four-year college.
Of course.
University, not community college or technical college.
Of course.
A scam, if we can agree on a definition, is where a majority of people who will go through the institution or business, they're not getting their money's worth, their time's worth, and they're being deceived when they sign up. So do we agree on those terms?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
He says that college should be about the pursuit of what is good, true, and beautiful.
What do you think is the purpose of going to college?
The purpose of college should be a traditional liberal arts education, the pursuit of what is good, true, and beautiful.
Okay.
That's not what it is. It should be the betterment of yourself and your soul, nurturing your character and becoming a better citizen, understanding the deeper things in life. At the very least, though, it should be preparing one for the job market.
Sounds fancy, right? But this phrase collapses under any real scrutiny. College is supposed to be about specializing in a field of knowledge. But in Charlie's view, who gets to say what's good? And while aesthetics is an important branch of philosophy, it isn't just about what is beautiful, it's about what makes something appealing at all. Then we move on, and Kirk targets gender studies majors.
Do you think that getting a degree in gender studies is good for society?
I would agree, yeah. Why would studying gender not be good for society?
Well, learning that men can give birth is not exactly a good use of time, is it?
Is that what they're teaching in college right
A lot
now?
of colleges, yeah. According to the Center for Disease Control, they no longer say women can give birth, they say birthing persons.
Mocking the CDC's use of birthing persons to be inclusive. But here's the part I found interesting. He says,
we're going to get there later. I don't think gender exists. I think that there are two sexes, infinite personalities, and no genders. However, let's get back to the core contention.
if that's sincere, it's the most progressive thing he's ever said, although I would bet that he would consider any form of transitioning a dysfunction of society. So take it for what it's worth. And when an economics major steps up, Kirk rattles off economists' names like he's playing trivia, not debating a real person.
I think I'm an econ major, and depending on what job I do in the future, I can still use the skills earned from that.
So tell me about Milton Friedman.
Tell me about Milton Friedman. He is an economist from...
How about Thomas Sowell?
Thomas Sowell.
Ludwig von Mises.
Well, I will say that I'm a first year.
How about
He does this a lot in an attempt to showcase the lack of knowledge obtained by college students. But he fails to articulate what the benefit of learning about these people would be as opposed to others that they have been taught. And my presumption would be that the actual economic principles are still taught even when not adding the economist's books as required reading. But unlike Kirk, I actually didn't go to college, so don't trust my hunch. When asked for a solution...
So what would your proposal be to fix the scam of college?
There is no proposal. The contention is college is a scam.
He admits he has none. His goal?
So then what's the point of that statement?
To get you to agree
But like, what would that do? Like, what do you want to fix in college that's going to help it not be a scam?
We can get to step interval 2 as long as you can agree that college is a scam.
No.
So basically he's the philosophical equivalent of a used car salesman, trying to get you to sign on the dotted line before he shows you the engine. Later, when confronted with a contradiction that if college is a scam, religion should be too, Kirk argues Christianity is true, so it's exempt.
I have a question, is church a scam?
No, because church is honoring the divine and the eternal and the good and the true and the beautiful.
Which is funny logic, because if all but one religion is wrong, there are still a lot of people getting scammed. But I guess eternal salvation isn't as important as a college degree. So when lawyers and doctors are safe, but gender studies grads are in scam city, it makes sense to throw out the baby with the bathwater and call colleges scams without caveat. When talking about trans women, Kirk defines a woman as
a woman is an adult female with XX chromosomes. You tell me, what is a woman?
This gets shot down immediately because some cis women have XY chromosomes and medical anomalies exist. Kirk pivots to functional sex organ.
So natural mutations upon the binary, essentially, right?
Yes. So,
but they don't have both sex organs that both operate, right?
Yeah, but that also I don't think necessarily works, right? Because if it's X,
one
just
is more
X,
dominant
and
than
there's
the other.
But that's a medical rabbit hole deeper than any philosophical PhD. It does, however, show that his definition isn't strong enough and requires immediate shifting once challenged. When one of the debaters says,
I also want to say that one of my best friends is trans, and I would say that she's more of a woman than I am.
Kirk asks,
So you said that person is more of a woman than you are. Therefore, you're grading off a definition of something accomplishes womanhood. What is that?
And I don't think when he asked this, he understood that using the term adult and making the distinction between a woman from a girl, you're already not talking strictly in terms of anatomy. You're talking about legal thresholds and social norms. So ironically, by trying to define womanhood in concrete binary terms, Charlie actually concedes that it's conditional. He built his entire argument on a definition that admits womanhood is, at least in part, a social construct. And I would say the best counterargument, besides those Charlie utilized against himself, is the bimodal distribution of hormone levels.
Would you say sex is binary by definition?
For sure, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you're already incorrect. Like, sex is not binary, it's bimodal. So if we look at a distribution graph, we're going to see people in two camps majority of the time, but there are going to be externalities on both ends of the spectrum and in the middle.
For example, like
so we already talked about intersex.
Right. Sex is not a neat binary, but a messy gradient. Sports rules evolve like fashion trends, only with more lawsuits. Or maybe about the same amount, but you get my point. I'm probably the wrong person to ask about this topic, though, because I don't have the same sanctity for sports that other people do. I think that if we really wanted to see the best athletes, we would have a PED league for every sport. I digress. Finally, Kirk claims,
my next claim is that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate.
Purely for identity politics. This completely ignores her accomplishments as a district attorney and a senator. You can think she was bad at her job, but to say she was underqualified is ridiculous. And calling someone a DEI candidate like it's a dirty word is just cheap rage bait. The problem isn't DEI itself, it's how it's sometimes misused or weaponized for optics. This isn't even the conservative perspective. But nuance isn't Kirk's strong suit, so we'll table this since systemic racism is the next topic on the list. I personally think that some of Charlie's most interesting content are his more professional-styled debates and discussions where Charlie somehow fails to argue topics he chose. Ah yes, Charlie Kirk showing us once again that he has a face made for radio and ideas made for silent films. The first example we'll look at is the debate between Charlie Kirk and Bernie Sanders' former press secretary, also known as Brianna Joy Gray, but I guess he thought she wouldn't get clicks. At first, they start with an unorganized first thought on systemic racism. Brianna lays out a well-reasoned framework.
And we need to talk about systemic racism because in a lot of people's imaginations, racism exists as, a bad guy in a Klan's hood and these kind of stereotypes. very explicitly denying people service, explicitly denying people a right to use the bathroom, the kind of racism that we understand from the 1960s. What we understand exists today is the aftershocks of a lot of those systems that were in place, not just interpersonal racism that existed at the time, but also the laws on the books that had real effects in terms of how people were able to grow and aggregate wealth at that time, and which has implications for the generations that have come since. And I think it's not about blaming people. It's not about hierarchies of oppression. It's just about understanding that this is how the world was, and snapping our fingers and getting rid of those prohibitive laws isn't going to change the effects of those prohibitive laws unless we do so affirmatively.
Systemic racism isn't about who gets slapped today, but about who's still limping from a 100-year-old beating.
Can you name one example?
Of systemic racism?
Yeah.
So what did you think about the example I brought up in my opening remarks? The example of housing discrimination and redlining.
Like redlining? Yes.
She brings up redlining, not as a one-time policy, but as a generational landmine. Wealth extraction dressed in neighborhood mapping, discrimination by zip code. Charlie, being Charlie, immediately latches onto an example she made rather than addressing it in relation to the totality of her argument. He chooses rather to cite Thomas Sowell and proudly notes that redlining wasn't just something white banks did.
So,
with redlining.
You know Thomas Sowell's treatise on redlining?
I don't.
Yeah, you should read it.
What does it say? Are you able to tell me
Yeah,
in this
it's
moment?
actually right here. He said, redlining, do you know that whites were turned down for mortgages more than Asians?
I'm unclear what relevance that has
Because
to
it
the
wasn't
white-
racially based. The redlining myth, according to Thomas Sowell, which I'm sure you believe in, says, quote, nor did either the mainstream media or political leaders ever mention the fact that black-owned banks turned down black mortgage loan applicants at least as often as white-owned banks did. Why were blacks turning down their own people?
It's a question asked with all the nuance of someone blaming firefighters for water damage. Charlie thinks he's found the loophole, but what he's really done is demonstrate his lack of any historical comprehension. Brianna's point wasn't that discrimination came with a white hood and a bank seal. It's that systems under racist conditions echo those conditions long after the laws change. Black banks were operating in an economy already poisoned. Denying loans wasn't betrayal, it was banking. Nobody has any major issues with banks considering individuals high risk, but when entire communities are labeled high risk based on racial percentages, quite literally removing them from the prospect of obtaining good loan rates, then it's a clear example of a form of systemic racism. And since there were actual redlining maps and policy that specifically aimed to discriminate, this isn't an argument about if it happened, but whether or not the impact has been sustained or mended. And arguing that it was never an issue at all is an example of the issue persisting. Charlie treats racism like a board game. Once the rulebook is updated, everybody starts fresh. But what he misses, and what Brianna tries patiently to explain, is that history doesn't reset when laws change, especially when considering generational wealth, housing equity, educational access. It's less we fixed it, more we bandaged a bullet wound with a Band-Aid.
Do you believe that during Reconstruction there was no racism? Do you believe that before
How many acres did slaves get at post-Civil War? 19 million acres blacks got.
Yes, Black Americans acquired 19 million acres during Reconstruction, but this wasn't land given as reparations. This was land bought by freed slaves and their descendants. And this land was often untenable and sometimes threatened by surrounding violence and intimidation. This is the bizarre claim that Charlie attempts to make not once, but twice during this conversation.
We did do a reparation program after Civil War. It was like 19 million acres given to Black Americans, like the size of South Carolina.
There was at one point an offer through Sherman's order of 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land in South Carolina and a few other states. This is where 40 acres and a mule comes from. But this was also quickly reversed by President Andrew Johnson after Lincoln's assassination, returning the land to the previous Confederate owners. So it seems like Charlie is maybe mixing up historical facts here.
Moving to the first question, since we didn't get to it, Brianna, is America systemically racist?
Well, there you go.
This question is laughably simplistic without some type of follow-up like, and if so, through what system? This is also a loaded question meant to signal to the audience, but we can believe in systemic racism existing in the vast land of America without it needing to always come from the top. And Joy Gray does attempt to expand on this by clarifying the difference between systemic and individual racism, but I actually just cite Oxford language. The definition of systemic is relating to a system, especially as opposed to a particular part. And this is to say that systemic racism exists as racism related to specific governmental and economic systems, as opposed to individual bias and/or inherent national sentiment.
But let me ask you a question. Do you think like the hyper-focus of like race in our national conversation detracts from having that kind of class-based discussion?
Sometimes.
Brianna answers this question in terms of her own view on the national sentiment towards Black people being focused only on the most affluent. And while this is often the case with people finally caring about racial issues when celebrities join social media campaigns, I think she is missing the actual societal issue that Kirk is attempting to gloss over. And that is the fact that Black and Hispanic Americans have a larger percentage of their populations in the lower class. It's an attempt to discredit those who have already been disenfranchised, and while he is right that we should try and uplift the lower class as a whole, that can't happen without understanding what got so many in that position to begin with. They eventually move on to what Kirk perceives as a modern form of segregation.
Black-only graduation ceremony.
Yeah, lots of universities have that. It's not Black only. It's just an additional Black. It's just an additional
right, which
graduation.
I think is like racist and wrong and awful.
Okay.
Joy Gray attempts to correct him on the fact that it is about uplifting the Black American culture, to which he asks,
but like if there was a white-only graduation ceremony, how would you think about that?
Well, if there were like, I don't know, a Catholic ceremony or an Irish ceremony,
but you can
or
convert to
a Hillel ceremony, I don't have an issue with it personally.
Okay, but Catholicism you can convert to, Hillel you could convert to, Irish.
Some people don't.
Well, you could convert to Judaism, but the Irish is culture, right, which is not racial inherently. There's very few people that aren't white that are Irish, but this idea of this like preference on melanin and DNA, like, isn't that really it's like a dangerous direction.
I find this argument funny whenever I see it, because Black Americans often band together because of the lack of historical ties to cultural identity because of slavery, where many white Americans know about their German or Italian or Norwegian roots. Many Black Americans do not, and thus feel a kinship with other descendants of slaves. And any white person claiming to feel a kinship to other white people outside of specific ethnic ties is because they identify with the American culture and were, for some reason, not raised to identify with their European roots. And while Black Americans can identify with American culture, white Americans cannot identify with Black American culture.
Where in the Federalist Papers does it justify slavery?
Why does it matter whether or not? No,
that's
Charlie,
the framework of our country.
No.
This statement almost seems like a joke with how easily Joy Gray was able to respond with the fact that the founding fathers owned slaves. And even after that, articulates how the founding fathers established this nation in order to form a more perfect union, dismantling the appeal to history and also to say that it isn't about fetishizing, her word, what they originally said. But she messed up in her phrasing of fetishizing, and Charlie Kirk latches on to that single phrase once again and responds.
Because the founding fathers wrote in our Constitution that we're pursuing a more perfect union, not fetishizing what they happened to write down at a constitutional convention over 250 years ago.
That's what you have to say about our founding fathers?
This shows that Charlie really isn't listening, because she wasn't talking about them. She was talking about Charlie's drooling over the Federalist Papers. Charlie then tries to bring up Thomas Jefferson's 1807 ban on the importation of slaves like it's some kind of slam dunk, as if signing off on the shipping restrictions makes up for spending your life profiting off of enslaved people. And yes, Jefferson signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves. He also owned over 600 human beings in his lifetime and freed less than 10, most of whom were his own children. born to a slave he impregnated. Jefferson didn't free his other slaves in life nor in death. Unlike George Washington, who at least had the decency to posthumously free the human beings he owned. And the 1807 ban wasn't a moral epiphany, it was an economic strategy. By that time, the domestic slave trade was booming. Stopping imports didn't stop slavery, it just made enslaved people already in the US more valuable. It's like banning foreign cars when you run a used car monopoly. You don't end the business, you just jack up the prices. And now it's time for what I think is probably the debate with the most memorable moments in Charlie Kirk's entire career. His debate with Ben Glebe on the topic of abortion. The title of this video refers to Ben Glebe as a comedian, quotes included, just in case we forgot sarcasm was invented by insecure debate bros who think the scare quote is a form of evidence. I assume they were trying to discredit his career, but ironically, debating what you think to be a failed comedian about political issues doesn't exactly exude superiority. So let's begin, and we start with Charlie's favorite party trick, the bad syllogism.
Here's the basic syllogism that I bring as a pro-life advocate. It is always wrong to intentionally kill a human life. Abortion is intentionally killing a human life, therefore abortion is morally wrong. And so you're going to be making an argument about choice, but some choices are wrong. For example, it's wrong to kill human beings. So you're going to have to make an argument to the audience why either A, this is not a human life, or B, why the mother has the right to murder her own child.
Sure. I'm going to choose the former of those options.
The syllogism. Philosophy's microwave dinner. Only this one's half-thawed. It requires us to accept, without question, that all fetuses at any stages are equivalent to human persons. That's not a conclusion, that's quite literally just outlining the discussion at hand. It's also painfully ironic coming from the guy who has no problem abstracting away people's lives the moment they're inconvenient to his worldview. Immigrants, protesters, people of color, suddenly life gets a lot more conditional. Now, Charlie attempts to double down with his next claim.
According to science of embryology, that sperm, when it is formed with an egg, creates a new being of deoxyribonucleic acid that is formed, that is magical, unique, and distinct only to that moment, therefore worthy of conception, and begins the process of the development of a full human being.
Firstly, deoxyribonucleic acid? Really? This man just said the full Latin name for DNA, as if syllables can substitute for substance. But let's humor him for a second. Yes, DNA is formed in fertilization, but DNA isn't the defining feature of personhood. Unique DNA forms in tumors, and I would hope Charlie would be in favor of removing those. And before I get people running to the comments, I'm not saying a fetus is like a tumor, but that DNA does not define personhood. Just to be clear. Because if having unique DNA defines personhood, then what about chimeras? People with two sets of unique DNA. This can happen due to fusion of zygotes in the womb or even from organ transplants later in life. But regardless, would having two sets of unique DNA make them have double personhood or two souls? I'd say no. And I think Charlie would too. And even among scientists, there is no consensus on when life, in terms of independent human personhood, begins. Is it fertilization, gastrulation, first brainwaves, viability, birth? It depends on who you ask and what you're trying to prove. But Charlie simplifies complexity into certainty because that's the only way his moral scaffolding doesn't collapse under inspection. Then he poses this.
Since you're fixated on sperm, a sperm, absent meeting an egg, does what?
It dies, Charlie. Yes. But so does a fetus absent of the womb. So does the child absent of care. And so does your moral consistency the moment we leave the zygote stage. If life is measured by what could be rather than what is, then every used condom is a tragedy. But I guess Charlie would probably agree with that. Then comes the very common Margaret Sanger misquote, a tried and tired tactic.
What do you have to say about the Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who's a eugenicist, who says we don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the black population? Does that bother you that Planned Parenthood is a eugenicist organization?
I've never heard that quote.
How about this one?
I doubt the authenticity of that quote, but if it's true, I obviously condemn that quote.
How about this one from Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger? Human beings, our goal is to eliminate human beings who never should have been born at all. Or birth control is nothing more or less weeding out the unfit. Are you comfortable associating yourself with eugenicists?
I'm not comfortable associating myself with eugenicists or that quote, if that answers your question.
Okay.
What he leaves out is that this was part of a letter about building trust in communities that were rightly suspicious of the medical establishment. This was literally a letter fearing the misrepresentation that Charlie's doing and was calling to hire minority doctors at their facilities in minority communities to ease tension during segregation. But Kirk doesn't want to analyze the past, he wants to weaponize it. And yes, Sanger held problematic views. So did nearly every great thinker prior to the Civil Rights era. Eugenics was a topic discussed by many at the time, including Teddy Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Alexander Graham Bell, and even Helen Keller. Some were due to bigotry, and others over intellectualism. But let's really appreciate the irony here. Charlie opposes universal health care, livable wages, access to contraception, but he's deeply concerned with how black lives are being eliminated by abortion. It's a talking point and a rhetorical strategy, but not a genuine concern he holds. Then it happens.
At 8 weeks, we have tails. At 8 weeks, an embryo has tails. Do humans have tails, Charlie?
I'm sorry, what?
Serious question. Do human beings have tails?
I'm not exactly sure the essence of the question.
Do human beings have tails? Do you have a tail?
You know, I have never met anyone with a tail. I'm not exactly sure the
Exactly. But fetuses have tails. Kind of proves that at that phase, they are not a human being. They got tails. Humans don't have tails. We're not dinosaurs. Let me even show you a photo, if I may, okay? Do you truly, in your heart of hearts, truly believe that this is a human being? This?
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt?
Yes.
This is a dolphin fetus.
So let me...
Without a doubt, a dolphin fetus is a human being. This is a human fetus. Look how similar they look, but quite different. Dolphin. You just confirmed that a dolphin... In life, do you confuse dolphins for human babies often?
So let me ask
you go to SeaWorld and you're like, someone's got human babies in that aquarium. Get the human babies out of the aquarium.
Well, you labeled it as a human fetus.
No,
so
I
you
did
that
not.
Dishonestly.
No, I did not. I didn't label it as anything.
Doesn't
say human fetus on there.
Let me ask you a question, though. So let's hold up those two pictures again.
Sure.
Is there a moral difference between the dolphin and the baby?
Plot twist. It's a sea creature. A mammal, but a sea creature nonetheless. Now, I don't personally think this is the gotcha Ben Glebe was thinking it was, but it is a confession. A perfect illustration of the fact that Charlie Kirk cannot tell the difference between species when shown a sonogram, and yet expects us to build national policy around his ability to distinguish moral nuance from ultrasound footage. It shows that this isn't an appeal to facts or reason, but rather an appeal to emotion. And this appeal continues in the next argument.
From as early as 12 weeks, and certainly by 20 weeks, an unborn child can feel pain. And by 10 weeks after conception, the child can make bodily movements. Electrical brain activity could be detected to 6 or 7 weeks.
This is true, but also entirely false. At 12 weeks, nociceptors, the sensors that detect harm, do begin forming. But the fetal cortex, which processes pain perception, doesn't even start its development until around 20 weeks. And what exists prior to that is reflex, not suffering. It's the difference between jumping at a hot stove and understanding why you shouldn't do it again. And the development of the cerebral cortex will eventually enable things like performance of motor tasks, judgment, abstract thinking, creativity, and maintaining social appropriateness, which speaks to the human condition a lot more than just the capacity to reflex in response to stimuli. And then, for some reason, we get an almost surreal moment.
One of these babies was conceived in rape. One of these babies was conceived in a consensual relationship. Which one's which?
Yes, you heard that right. The same guy who mistook a human fetus for a dolphin fetus now wants Glebe to play Guess That Trauma with medical imagery. Not only is this morally reprehensible, it underlines just how much this debate relies on Kirk's constant use of pathos over reason. And honestly, I genuinely believe Charlie had this one locked and loaded before the debate, and after the dolphin fiasco, he felt it necessary to try and get his get back. And then he continues his intellectual tirade, throwing us this gem.
How many families
I'm
do you
handling
think...
my cards pretty good.
How many families do you think are waiting for children right now to adopt in America?
Charlie, you're aware that there are far more...
Ballpark.
There are far more babies in foster homes and, in the foster program and in orphanages.
Just take a guess.
There's not enough.
Guess.
There's not enough.
Guess.
Guess what?
How many families are waiting to adopt right now in America on waiting lists?
I don't know the answer.
Just guess a little bit.
1 million.
2 million.
Okay. And
how many abortions are there every single year?
Your point is what?
Guess.
Your point is what?
Just take a guess.
Your point is what? Let's say it's exactly 2 million, I bet is what you got you. Okay,
so there's
great.
twice as many families waiting to adopt than we terminate children every single year.
And you're aware there are also children who are in the adoptive care system that cannot get adopted, right? Are you aware of that fact?
Why do you think they're in the adoptive care system and the foster care system?
Because a lot of people are forced through restrictive abortion laws that people like you force on people who don't care.
Red tape. So we should make it easier to adopt. Do you agree?
Sure.
Okay, so we agree. So therefore, if we get rid of abortion, we have enough families waiting to adopt, and every child will be taken care of.
And yet again,
we have solved the abortion issue, everybody. And Ben agrees.
No, because yet
enough
again,
families to adopt.
No.
All the abortions would go away, and everyone gets a loving parent. And Ben would have to go back to obsessing about sperm.
Look how.
Isn't it sweet? Classic supply and demand, only with the lives of our most innocent. And here's the real problem. What happens after 3 years? We've run out of adoptive families. And now we're backlogged with 1 million extra babies year over year added to a foster system that's already overloaded with over 300,000 children currently. And that's because not all of the 2 million families are lining up for any child. And beyond that, not every person wanting a child is fit to raise them. It's the easiest solution for someone who isn't dealing with an unwanted pregnancy or the foster care system. And then, when it feels like all hope is lost for a thoughtful conversation, he offers yet another weird analogy.
Over 500,
maybe this is why you go home and you just chill at home like,
Over 500,000 people are currently hooked up to a machine and comatose. According to you, being a webbed person or being somewhat non-human is okay. Should we just pull the plug of all of them?
Sure, Charlie. Except those people once had autonomy. You're comparing potential life to once lived life, equating an embryo with a brain-dead adult. And even if we continue with this logic, we do not extend life support indefinitely. People sign DNRs, and sometimes families have to make decisions in difficult situations. The difference is, once again, the fact that the adult on life support had already once reached a level of viability outside of the womb, and thus the legal and social rights of personhood. They continue for a while arguing the legal status of abortion and whether or not there are actual laws in favor or opposing abortion. Charlie at this point explains that he's a pro-natalist wanting to increase the US population, which I feel like could be its own video, but towards the end, Ben Glebe brings up January 6th in an attempt to draw an analogy of forgiving people's mistakes.
You're okay with broadly undermining our democracy by backing an insurrection literally to overthrow the election of our nation that you supported. I mean, Turning Point's literally funded Trump's Jan 6 rally.
So, Ben, I have a question.
That led to an insurrection attempt on our government and the death of many people, including police officers that you claim to love and care for.
And Charlie melts down.
Where was I on January 6th?
You were doing a podcast in which you said, I'm getting 500 emails a minute of people saying we want civil war and ginning that up.
You were
and
arrested
also,
at the Capitol.
not that day,
And
not
I
that
was
day.
in Phoenix, Arizona.
And you also sent bus loads of people to the Capitol on Jan 6.
Our students never got near the Capitol.
None of them. None of them?
They were actually at the they were at the ellipse.
And none of them
2 miles
walked.
away.
None of them walked. So you do take blame for the insurrection that happened on Jan 6?
I take no blame. That's slanderous and wrong.
Why do you take no blame for it? You sent buses of people there.
To the ellipse that got nowhere near the Capitol. You're the insurrectionist.
But that day
here.
that you ginned
that
up,
is libelous and slanderous,
that day,
and you know it.
That you said you were sending patriots to fight.
I
for
said
Trump.
nothing like that.
Yes, you did. You said you sent patriots to fight.
Metaphorically fight.
And you said they want a civil war.
This is so typical
you
of the
encouraged
left,
a civil war.
where you come in here, where you yourself have been arrested at the Capitol,
Peaceful,
and you try to say that I am
protesting.
something
That's different.
You are a domestic terrorist and a failed presidential candidate no one's ever heard of.
So you're
and
not,
you have the balls to come in here and try to call me that. This right here is exactly why we're not going to come together as a nation or this. You dishonestly come in here with poorly researched talking points where I was 2,000 miles away from Phoenix, Arizona
incite
that day.
a mob from a distance?
Let me be very clear. You're the one that's actually been arrested before.
Yeah.
I have not, nor our
Peaceful
students,
protesting.
and they got nowhere near.
None of them
and
did.
let me just finish by saying this. You're done. Let me finish by saying this. This is exactly why no one trusts half the country.
I promise
because
here's
they
my last
dishonestly
sentence.
lie
Charlie.
about this, and they think they got one, when they themselves are actually the domestic terrorists and the people that have attacked our democracy. He's been arrested. I haven't. Thank you, Ben, so much.
He storms off and actually cuts the final words from Glebe.
Promise here's my last sentence.
Thank you guys so much.
I promise here's my last sentence.
Thank you.
Oh, no, hold on.
We're done.
Last sentence.
But Ben was recording for his own purposes and released the final words in which he expresses,
If you're not responsible for what happened on Jan 6, is that because unintended consequences happened that you didn't anticipate?
I hope that
kind of like mothers that have an unintended pregnancy, they didn't anticipate. So if you want to be cut some slack for Jan 6, maybe you could cut women some slack. Who unintentionally get pregnant. Does that sound like a deal?
You're the domestic terrorist.
I was arrested for peaceful protesting, my friend.
Thank you. Domestic terrorist.
You ginned up an insurrection on our country.
Kirk stands over him, extending for a handshake. Seemingly an attempt at a power move. Glebe keeps eye contact, doesn't flinch. Charlie looms over him. Classic failed intimidation. Especially because he ends up pulling away first. What was Ben Glebe talking about Charlie Kirk supporting those active on January 6th? Well, after doing some independent research, it appears Charlie Kirk was never actually charged for involvement in January 6th, but he was deposed. In May of 2022, the House Select Committee investigated the January 6th insurrection and subpoenaed him for testimony. His name had surfaced repeatedly, tied not just to his presence in the social media ecosystem, but materially through his organization, Turning Point Action, which helped fund and coordinate transportation to the rally. In the deposition, Kirk invoked the Fifth Amendment like it was one of the only phrases he's ever been taught. Not once, not twice, but to nearly every question asked, including basic stuff like, what's your highest level of education and how old are you? Which was especially weird because, as stated by the investigative counsel at the beginning of the record, the Fifth Amendment provides a witness the ability to refuse to answer a question if they have a reasonable belief that a truthful answer could be used against them in a criminal prosecution, not simply because the witness would prefer not to answer the question. Why then all the silence? Maybe the nerves were starting to get to him. Because, as the record shows, Turning Point Action received at least $1 million from Publix heiress Julie Fancelli to help mobilize people to DC, including funding for buses and promotional material. Kirk originally said his org wasn't involved. Then, after the money showed up, magically, they were. He also acknowledged, albeit through a now deleted tweet, that Turning Point USA helped send 80-plus buses full of patriots to the Capitol. That number was later revised, down to just 7. When asked about payments for Donald Trump Jr. and Kimberly Guilfoyle's speeches, Kirk once again pled the Fifth, even though invoice records showed $60,000 being paid out for their contributions to the January 6th rally stage. And yet, when violence broke out, Charlie was quick to disavow. On his live stream that very day, he denounced the Capitol breach, saying it was reprehensible. And in private, when asked, why are you even saying there's a legitimate argument that President Trump incited the mess at the Capitol? Kirk replied, very maturely, it is the honest thing to say, which, when compared to his statements on January 6th since, is quite shocking in contrast.
how did he overturn or try to overturn the U.S. Constitution?
He did not win the election, and he claimed that he did, and he did everything in his power to stay in power.
Are you allowed to challenge results of an election?
Absolutely.
That's what he
recounts,
did.
Recounts.
But no, I mean, look, that was a very expensive, very trying thing unnecessarily, right? And because look, I mean, Steve Bannon went to prison by this very same committee. Peter Navarro went to prison from this very same committee. I mean, it was, you know, serious stuff. And so, but just going through that whole process, it definitely, I can speak candidly about this part. Other stuff, there's nothing to talk about, but I'll just let the testimony speak for itself. Which is, my testimony can tell the whole story. Is this, look, and I think it's very clear that this hardened me in a way where I knew we had to win or else this country was going off a lawfare cliff, the likes of which we would not survive.
Kirk wants to promote himself as a patriot, a strategist, a populist beacon. But when the receipts start flying, he turns into a mime on trial. His silence wasn't stoic, it was strategic. Next, we'll examine how Kirk leverages religious rhetoric to frame political struggle as spiritual warfare. And now we hear from the gospel according to Kirk, a mix of theology and freshman philosophy. Let me start by recommending Dan McClellan, a biblical scholar who's done an excellent job analyzing the linguistic and theological fallacies in Kirk's takes.
Where in the scriptures does a Christian...
Well, thank you. Jeremiah 29:7, demand the welfare of the nation that you are in because your welfare is tied to your nation's welfare.
So that is absolutely not what Jeremiah 29:7 says. And this is an awful argument because Jeremiah 29:7 is addressing a specific set of circumstances and is not generalizable to any peoples in any nation in any circumstance. And it starts in verse 4, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile." Seek is the verbal root darash. It does not mean demand. Welfare is the noun shalom or peace. Ir means city. It does not mean nation. Where I have sent you into exile. That's the verbal root gala, which usually means to uncover, but can also mean to send into exile. And here it is in the causative stem, the hifil stem. I have caused you to be sent into exile. And pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare or peace, shalom, you will find your welfare or peace, shalom. So in other words, this is telling the Judean exilees, you're not going to find your peace in an immediate return to Jerusalem. That's not going to happen. Get comfy in Babylon. This is not generalizable to all peoples in all nations, in all circumstances, in all times. And it does not say to demand. It does not say to grab the levers of power. It says to seek the peace of the city of Babylon because you're going to be there for a while. This is not at all a general defense of Christian nationalism.
Not only is he great at countering the issues of Kirk's theological assessments, he's a walking rebuke to the idea that a degree in humanities makes you unemployable, or that BYU only turns out missionaries and NFL players.
Move on to Jim Crow.
Time out. Slavery actually had a minority approval rating by the time of the U.S. founding. We were the second nation ever to abolish slavery.
So we were not the second nation. If we're talking about actual formally recognized nations, we were like 22nd on the list. Now, Vermont, which identified itself as an independent republic in 1777, again abolished adult slavery. And it would become a state, I believe, in 1791. So if you count Vermont as a nation, it was not recognized as a nation at the time, but if you count that, then Vermont would be first. Massachusetts would be the first state in the U.S. to abolish slavery in their constitution. But when it comes to the United States as a nation, that would take decades more, and we would not be even in the top 20 in terms of nations abolishing slavery.
But now let's dig into a few examples of Kirk's public displays of scriptural malpractice. First, we'll start with the time Kirk was confronted by a college student questioning him about objective morality.
I've seen you talk a lot about objective morality. And my big question is, can you explain to me why you think we need to have some kind of absolute standard for morality?
Excellent question. It's really good.
Kirk immediately reaches for the book of matches and asks,
so you put 1,000 Jews in a gas chamber, and the Nazis thought what they were doing was good, and they pressed the button. Were they right or were they wrong in gassing millions of Jews?
This is a setup, a trap that weaponizes moral repulsion to shut down complexity. But the answer is simple. It's not that the Holocaust was objectively bad in some metaphysical Platonic sense. It was bad because we agree that genocide is evil. That agreement isn't written in the stars, it's written in our shared history. Nazi Germany didn't see their actions as evil. They saw themselves as righteous. That's why objective morality becomes little more than my team's perspective is the universe default. In reality, morality is a subjective reflection on objective events. Killing isn't wrong because it's the act of ending a life. It's wrong because of how we interpret why someone's life ended. Self-defense and murder are both forms of killing. It's not the action but the intent and context that matter. And no amount of moral chest thumping makes that ambiguity disappear. Then there's the infamous Jesus cosplayer moment. A student dressed as Jesus confronts Kirk with a message of love and neighborly compassion. You know, the actual core tenets of Christian teachings. But Kirk isn't interested in theology. He wants another trivia night.
All right, why don't you ask me the questions? I'm sure you have plenty of them.
Okay, what's the Hebrew word for father?
Man, let me tell you something. Abba.
I'm sorry?
Abba.
That's the Greek word for father.
Yeah, Greek, whatever.
He would be correct to act high and mighty if Jesus spoke Hebrew, but he didn't, and Charlie knows this.
What language did Jesus speak?
Aramaic.
The term Abba is Aramaic for father, and I'm not acting like the guy knew that, but it means we can't say with 100% certainty he wasn't Jesus. The Hebrew word for father is Av or Ab, but Charlie didn't mention that part, so even in his own gotcha moment, Charlie fumbles the cultural context. Then, in what he clearly thinks is a slam dunk, Kirk misquotes John 10:10, saying,
It's one of the most popular verses in the Bible. John 10:10, the enemy has come to lie, steal, steal, and destroy.
Who wrote that?
This is an attempt to draw division from supposed opposition, and it is a misquote. That's not the verse in any translation. The actual text, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." The difference? Lie isn't in there. Neither is cheating. But those words sound meaner and punchier, more like something you'd hear from a political operative rather than a carpenter from Nazareth. Which is fitting. And the verse is just a slice of the Good Shepherd and his sheep, about Jesus presenting himself as the gate, the shepherd, the path to salvation. It's not about the enemy in contemporary political sense, but Kirk reads scripture like it's a campaign ad, selectively and always in service to the narrative. The verse Charlie specifically invokes is Jesus contextualizing that there will be false prophets who only work towards destruction, and the point the Jesus cosplayer is trying to make isn't that he is the real Jesus, even though he did jokingly say that.
You're pretending to be Jesus, but tell me why you're here.
I am Jesus, and I didn't write the scriptures, I lived them.
Our Jesus stand-in is trying to promote a callback to true Christianity, like loving thy neighbor as thyself, to which Charlie quickly inquires.
I said love your neighbor and love everybody. That's something that you guys really need to figure out.
Hold on a
and
second.
I know I got some of my fan club
let's
here.
Hold on a second. Hold on. What are those two verses?
My name was Yeshua. Let's
love your neighbor as yourself. Where is that in the Bible?
I don't know. I didn't write it.
Leviticus 19.
At this point, Charlie is trying to point out that he doesn't know the Torah, even though he's claiming to be Jesus. It does come from Leviticus 19 as a declaration of law from God to Moses, but it is also restated by Jesus in Mark chapter 12, verses 29 through 31, when he is asked about the greatest commandments, saying this is the second only to loving God above all things.
I would say this: if you really are a fan of mine and you're in my fan club, just be a nicer person, man.
Well, where does it say to be nice in the Bible?
It's pretty much all over
No,
there. That was kind of
what
the
does the word nice mean in Latin?
The point I was trying to
It means
make.
ignoramus.
The word nice comes from the Latin word nisius, which means ignorant. And in the King James Version of the Bible, it does say in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 38, "But if any man be ignorant, let him be ignorant." And while Charlie is very ignorant, I wouldn't consider him particularly kind, which is the modern parlance for the term nice. And in the Bible, in reference to being kind, you will find examples in the Old Testament like Proverbs chapter 11, verse 17. "Those who are kind benefit themselves, but the cruel bring ruin to themselves." And in the New Testament, Jesus even goes so far as to say in Luke chapter 6, verse 27 through 28, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." Which I suppose Charlie won't have to worry about as long as he sticks to the offensive. In another encounter, Kirk is asked about Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 25. "If you are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise." The verse lays out legal distinctions. If no further harm comes from the woman or child, a fine is paid. But if injury occurs, it's life for life. But I think a more sharp analysis of this is the fact that the Bible outlines something as specific as a forced miscarriage being wrong, but doesn't explicitly state anything about a woman who might do it to herself or hire an individual to do it purposefully. He then pivots to Luke 1.
In Luke 1, when Elizabeth came in contact with Mary and both were babies, what did it say that John the Baptist did?
I cannot tell you that.
He leapt.
Okay.
Do non-babies leap?
I don't understand the question.
From that leap, Kirk tries to take a leap and argue that personhood begins at conception, because a fetus at some point of development leapt. But we've also already discussed how the nociceptor activity causing reflexive movement does not indicate personhood, so non-starter. And when debating with Ben Glebe, he actually used an argument against abortion invoking Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5.
So what does it say in Jeremiah? I knew you before what?
I have no idea.
You were in the womb.
And I feel like this is one of the weakest arguments Kirk makes because it almost breaks his point, because it would be claiming that life starts before the egg's fertilization, meaning personhood is almost entirely metaphysical. In each case, Kirk's use of religious language isn't just misguided, it's tactically empty. His theology is utilitarian. It serves only to strengthen his political position, not to explore moral truth. Scripture isn't a source of humility or reflection, it's a debate strategy. Kirk weaponizes religion the same way a scam artist uses a fake badge, not to uphold law, but to fake authority. Turning Point USA says it exists to help college students. They say they're building a grassroots conservative revival, one organic campus rant at a time. But it's not about helping students succeed on campus, it's seemingly about seeding loyal foot soldiers for the culture war. In their own words, they aim to identify, educate, and organize the next generation of Americans to live in freedom on over 3,000 campuses. But as we've seen, Charlie has no problem misrepresenting factual information when it suits the narrative he's wishing to present. This, mixed with his call for people to turn away from higher education, rather than just a reformation of some kind, feels like an attempt to farm uneducated sycophants that will spout his rhetoric as law. Turning Point USA also has their professor watch list, which we touched on earlier, a sort of Yelp for tattling on people's professors. Some of these professors are a tad bit completely unhinged. But setting up a site for your fan base to find targets of harassment who can't be tried legally but who you deem need to be held accountable is a little more than spreading information. And it doesn't stop at ideas. In 2020, Turning Point Action, not the student side, but the political action wing, was caught running a literal troll farm out of Arizona, hiring young people to post pro-Trump propaganda across social media under fake accounts, pretending to be average citizens. You know, normal politics stuff. Turning Point isn't building up students, it's building a pipeline. They don't foster learning, they cultivate loyalty. And not to ideas, but to branding. And those who end up listening become the backing that allowed Charlie to earn over $300,000 a year and buy a luxury condo in Florida, all while getting to preach about how his business is a nonprofit. And what does Turning Point do for student communities? It distracts them, it polarizes them, and it replaces action with aesthetics. And the truth is, Turning Point USA's power isn't on college campuses. It's in who they help get into office and who they try to push out. Their goal isn't just to empower students. It's to manufacture ideological loyalty at scale. To create a future where the public mirrors their talking points before they're old enough to rent a car. They're not building student leaders. They're farming political foot soldiers, loyal to the brand, fluent in the rhetoric, and eager to legislate from comment sections. And that's because Turning Point isn't a student movement. It's a venture-backed costume pretending to be a rebellion. So here I am, doing everything I can, holding on to what I am, pretending I'm a Superman. Oh, hey, I've been doing a little research. There's a few things I noticed. This could truly go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. But the truth is, Charlie Kirk isn't dangerous because he's profound or crafty. He's dangerous because he's able to stay plausible. Because in a culture that rewards confidence over clarity, he speaks just fast and smug enough to sound like he knows something. He didn't rise because he fought through the noise, he became the noise. Not a grassroots leader, but a pre-packaged brand, manufactured to capitalize on confusion. He doesn't engage to understand. He engages to dominate, to speak first, loudest, and last. Turning Point USA claims to empower students. What it actually does is manufacture content, turning young people into ideological amplifiers, trained to repeat talking points rather than wrestle with contradictions. It creates an aesthetic of rebellion without the burden of critical thought. And once they've handed you a t-shirt and a slogan, they send you out. Not to lead, not to build, but to react. To perform conviction on command like a walking billboard. It's not about who's most qualified. It's about who's the most compliant, the most camera ready, the most brand aligned. And that's what Kirk represents. Not an individual threat, but a cultural perception that rewards charisma over truth, loyalty over literacy, and conception over action. He is not the exception, he is a symptom of the rule. And maybe that's the most tragic part. He didn't have to be clever. He just had to be confident, consistent, and convenient. And in a society that fears nuance, a man who never hesitates sounds like a prophet. But prophets lead people somewhere. Charlie just keeps them circling the merch table. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment down below on all of the reasons you think that I'm an idiot and got it completely wrong. And become a member if you're interested in seeing some of the behind-the-scenes content, some of the research streams, as well as what I plan on making a video on. Thank you so much. so much. I really do appreciate it. This is Tapin Quasar, signing off.